She was the first large passenger liner built in Germany after the First World War, one of the most famous and beautiful ships ever of the golden age of ocean liners. The SS Bremen, fondly remembered even today, was a record setter in numerous areas. Speed, principally. She was the liner that finally took the Blue Riband, the North Atlantic speed record, away from the British liner Mauretania, who had won it way back in 1909. But Bremen was a lot more than just an aquatic Teutonic speed demon. She was trim and beautiful, a symbol of national pride and resurgence, and a work of art in her own right. Art Deco, to be precise. You could get a drink on board, which was attractive to thirsty Americans. Beginning in 1929, German spit polish and brass Umpapa style were back on the North Atlantic, and the Bremen was an unmistakable wake-up call. The Germans were back in business. Bremen was one of the great cultural and engineering achievements of Germany's Weimar Republic, which was nearly at the end of its brief golden age, the Glückliche Zwanziger Jahre, the Golden 20s. Unfortunately, this beautiful era was short-lived and was eclipsed, like the Bremen herself, by politics, nationalism, and hate. This is her story. I'm Sean Munger. I'm author, historian, podcaster, and teacher. I teach history courses online at my website, seanmunger.com. I have a podcast, Green Screen, and another podcast, Second Decade, so check those out if you like historical stuff. For many years, I've had a passion for the great ocean liners, particularly those of the early 20th century. They were art objects as much as engineering marvels, and the Bremen definitely embodies this perfect marriage of form and function. Her story also illustrates how the great liners can't be separated from their historical context. Bremen's story is also the story of a nation in transition, from relative freedom and openness to darkness and repression. Of course, I'm talking about the rise of the Nazi Party, which I'll get to in due course. But first, let's take a look at this magnificent ship, and we'll start with how she came to be. We think of World War I as happening mostly in France, but there's a reason why it's called World War I. It did happen globally, including on the oceans. The First World War was almost an extinction-level event for the great transatlantic ocean liners, most of whom were turned into armed cruisers, hospital ships, or troop ships. Germany's merchant and passenger fleets were especially decimated, and not just during the war. When peace came, the Allies passed out Germany's surviving ocean liners among each other like Pokemon cards. The largest of them, Vaterland, became the American liner Leviathan, debuting in 1923. Germany was essentially off the market when it came to large, luxurious passenger liners. Just as well, the country was so broke in the early 20s, they couldn't have afforded one anyway. By the mid-20s, though, things were changing. In 1926, North German Lloyd, one of Germany's two big shipping companies, placed an order for two huge liners to be built simultaneously. This was right after several economically strapped German shipbuilders merged to form a consortium. The major player in this conglomerate was the old shipbuilder A.G. Weser of Bremen, who got one of the contracts. Bremen, the ship, was built here, in Bremen, the city, at the traditional shipyards of A.G. Weser. This area has been redeveloped in this century, but this is the location where it was. The other ship, destined to be Europa, was under construction simultaneously at the Blum and Voss shipyards in Hamburg. The conglomerate, whose German name is way too hard for me to pronounce, I'll throw it up there on the screen, had about 12,000 employees, 5,000 of which were employed basically full-time, knocking Bremen together. This was a massive undertaking. 7,000 tons of high-strength steel, 20 oil-fired water tube boilers, 4 giant single-reduction geared turbines, 4 propellers, and the latest in engineering design, including a weirdly shaped hydrodynamic bow foot, which is now standard on big ships, but Bremen was among the first to use it. It was invented by an American naval engineer, by the way. Bremen was 938 feet long, 101 feet wide, and had a gross weight of 51,600 tons. She was built to be very fast, for both commercial and prestige reasons. The launch of Bremen in Europa occurred on successive days in August 1928. Paul von Hindenburg, the president of Germany, was present at Bremen's launch. Hindenburg, the closest thing the Germans had to a military hero of World War I, whose reputation was anything close to intact, did the honors. Hindenburg would later play a significant role in the final days of the Weimar Republic. Launching is not the beginning of a ship's career, it's only when she goes into the water for the first time. Each of the giant liners spent a long time in what they call the fitting out basin, getting ready for actual service. Europa was supposed to debut first just in time for the beginning of the peak transatlantic sailing season in the spring. Unfortunately, on March 26, 1929, at about 3 o'clock in the morning, a fire broke out aboard Europa, which was sitting at the fitting out basin in Hamburg. This disastrous fire resulted in almost the total gutting of the ship, which was almost finished, and a year's delay. This put Bremen, the younger sister, in the spotlight. Bremen, not Europa, would go first. On July 16, 1929, Bremen departed on her maiden voyage from Bremerhaven to New York City. She could carry about 2,100 passengers, of which 800 were first class, and they traveled in style. Here are some views of the digs aboard Bremen, an Art Deco masterpiece. But even the second and third class accommodations were pretty posh, at least by the standards of other transatlantic lines. When talking about passenger experience, the tons of fresh meat, fowl, wines, port, champagne, tens of thousands of eggs, innumerable bags of flour and butter, and all the caviar you could cram down your gullet, all of that certainly helps, but the real key to delivering luxury service on the North Atlantic in 1929 was water. Yep, water. Bremen had an unusually large fresh water tank, 9,500 gallons, which meant running water for the first-class cabins. You don't think about luxury liners hauling water across the Atlantic, but they did. Bremen also had a nifty little novelty, a catapult installed on her upper deck, which, when they neared land, would shoot a plane into the air to deliver sacks of mail carried aboard the ship, hours earlier than it would have taken otherwise. A few hours before arrival in New York, a 27-year-old pilot named Jobst von Baron Jobst von Studnitz, who was an early pilot for Lufthansa, brought the mail from Bremen to New York. Getting your mail a couple of hours earlier didn't really make a whole lot of practical difference, but the North German Lloyd line milked it for all it was worth. The launch of the airmail seaplane made front page in New York, where crowds eagerly awaited the ship's first arrival. Bremen's maiden voyage was historic. She passed Ambrose Channel Lightship at the entrance to the port of New York 4 days, 17 hours, and 42 minutes after leaving Bremerhaven, which, if you do the math, worked out to an average speed of 27.9 knots. That meant the Brits had to cough up the Blue Riband, that's the Atlantic speed record, which had been held by the Cunard liner Mauretania since 1909. This was a major blow to British national pride and one of the reasons why the British got right to work on their own superliners to try to get the record back. They eventually became the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. Just to rub it in a little, on the trip back, her first voyage eastbound across the Atlantic, Bremen clinched the record again, the first time ever that a single ship captured the speed record in back-to-back voyages. The summer of 1929 was truly the Halcyon Days for Bremen and on the North Atlantic in general. Barely 3 months later, on October 24th, and again on October 29th, 1929, the American stock market crashed dramatically. Contrary to the impression left by many history books, the Great Depression didn't begin immediately. It's not like it was oysters and champagne on Wednesday and the bread line on Thursday. The transition took a couple of months. But it was soon clear, only a few months into Bremen's operational life, that a major economic upheaval had occurred. The real picture of Bremen's history isn't clear unless you consider the background and context, where she came from and the country that gave birth to her. This is why, although this video is about a ship, we've got to talk about Weimar Germany in general. Bremen was, in many ways, the essence of what Weimar Germany was capable of producing in its very short heyday. We call it Weimar Germany because that's where the capital was, Weimar, not Berlin, though culturally speaking, Berlin was the drummer that the rest of the country danced to. I'm going to cover this very briefly. The story is pretty well known, but it is relevant to the story of Bremen and why she was, to use a 50-cent word, the apotheosis of her age. The Weimar Republic arose quickly and somewhat haphazardly out of the smoking ruins that resulted from the collapse of Imperial Germany at the end of World War I. At the end of 1918 and beginning of 1919, a communist revolution threatened to topple the newborn German parliamentary democracy, which was weak and awkward as a newborn giraffe. The first German chancellor of the Republic, Friedrich Ebert, made something of a deal with the devil by deploying a paramilitary group called the Freikorps, consisting of volunteer former soldiers from the German armed forces, to put down the communists. It worked, but many members of the Freikorps, which was outlawed in 1921, later turned up in the Nazi paramilitary groups. At the Versailles Peace Conference, the Allies really wanted to stick it to Germany, who they blamed for causing the war. The gargantuan bill for reparations and indemnities that the Allies forced on Germany caused inflation to spiral to utterly ridiculous heights in the early 20s, and there was still a lot of real suffering, especially among children who were literally starving to death. This story, as I said earlier, is well known. What's less well known and often gets lost when we talk about stuff like starving babies and a loaf of bread costing billions of Reichsmarks is that the Weimar Republic actually started to get its act together later in the 1920s, and the former Allies were, in a fashion, trying to help, at least a little. Charles Dawes, Vice President of the United States, helped negotiate a financial deal between American and German banks that made it much easier for Germany to make some of those ruinous reparations payments. The economy did stabilize, at least compared to what it had been before, and more people were working. Where Weimar really excelled, though, was its culture. Between 1924 and 1929, Berlin was arguably the most vibrant and cosmopolitan city in Europe. It was full of chic restaurants and bawdy nightclubs. The famous musical and movie Cabaret was made about this kind of thing. Scientists and philosophers, many of them Jewish, were having a heyday at German universities. German filmmakers like F.W. Murnau and Fritz Lang were breaking new ground in cinema. Nosferatu, still a terrifying horror film after 100 years, came out in 1922, and Metropolis, the biggest science fiction epic of the silent era from 1927, were stretching the boundaries of what was possible in the medium. Weimar Germany was also friendly to feminism and LGBT rights, a rarity in the Western world of the 1920s. Although homosexuality was still technically illegal in Germany, the Weimar Republic was very lax in its censorship of popular media, and as a result, a lot of gay magazines and literature sprang up in Berlin. The lesbian scene was said to be especially vibrant in Berlin in the late 20s. Berlin was one of the few places in Europe where transgender people had relatively safe spaces. Stress, of course, on the relatively, as it's easy to overestimate how progressive the country truly was, what with the Nazis on the rise. So, back to the Bremen. In many ways, the ship did represent Germany on the world stage. That's the reason it was decorated so lavishly in Art Deco styles, reflecting the most advanced and cosmopolitan tastes. Atlantic crossings on Bremen, and eventually her sister ship Europa, were fun. European ships were attractive to Americans seeking to cross the Atlantic. Prohibition was still going on in the United States in 1929, and the moment you stepped aboard a European ship, you could legally get a drink. For this reason, American passengers tended to head for the bar pretty much immediately, and not a few of them stayed there for most of the voyage. But there was a conservative, traditional side to life aboard Bremen as well. Brass bands playing on the deck were frequent entertainment, and well into the Nazi era, there was an onboard curfew of 1 a.m. for passengers. So it wasn't a party all the time, but enough of one that eventually, after Bremen and Europa were introduced, German liners handled 12% of the overall passenger traffic on the North Atlantic. Although it came relatively early in Bremen's life cycle as a ship, the Great Depression was a major fulcrum in its history. After all, it was eventually the Depression, more than anything else, that would bring the Nazis to power. The Depression devastated the North Atlantic passenger business. You see in this period a consolidation of shipping companies who could no longer compete with each other profitably. In fascist countries like Italy and eventually Germany, the big lines were brought under semi-state control. And even in non-fascist countries like Britain, the major lines were still heavily subsidized by the government. You could argue that as fun as the Bremen was, 1929 was the worst possible moment to go for broke on a big utility like a huge, expensive-to-run passenger liner. As it turned out, the Weimar Republic couldn't survive the Depression either. That's the next major act in the Bremen story. If you're enjoying this video, I'd love for you to do me a favor. Most YouTubers say, please like, subscribe, share. I'm not going to do that. If you like this video, the best way you can help me to make more videos is by watching another one of my videos right after this one. I've just done one, for example, on the history of the USS California, 1920s era battleship that was almost destroyed in the Pearl Harbor attack, but which lived to fight another day. So if you're into nautical history, you might enjoy that one, or you can check out some of the other stuff on my channel. And now, back to the Bremen. This is the Hofbrauhaus im Platzl, a famous old beer hall in Munich, Germany. Aside from looking stunning and like a place you can get the awesomest beer and soft pretzel of your life, this is, believe it or not, the kind of place where the Nazi movement was born. In post-war Germany, when many young men were unemployed, they spent their days in places like this, swilling cheap beer and belly-aching about how life had been unfair to them. the grievances, economic, cultural, and racial, that the Nazis stoked in their rise to power. It's no accident that Adolf Hitler's first serious encounter with the Nazi Party in 1920 occurred in a beer hall, or that he launched his unsuccessful insurrection in Munich in 1923 in a beer hall, the famous Beer Hall Putsch. Nazis did a lot of recruiting in places like this. A lot of the goons who put on brown shirts and went stomping around in the streets looking for communists and Jews to beat up had been former members of the now outlaw Freikorps. See, here they are again. The Weimar government couldn't deal with the second major economic collapse in less than 10 years. Remember that sweetheart deal the US vice president negotiated, the Dawes Plan? Well, after the Depression hit the US hard, American banks withdrew their capital, which meant the Dawes Plan went down the toilet, and Germany was again being crushed by those severe reparations payments. Unemployment went through the roof. The fragile economic gains many Germans had made in the late 20s were wiped out. Bad times were here again. What was Hitler's message to the masses? I alone can fix it. Hitler's right-wing Nazi party won almost 20% of the popular vote in the elections of 1930 and got his stooges into the Reichstag, Germany's parliament. It's almost unfair how Bremen and especially Europa were basically cheated out of what should have been their heyday. Europa, finally recovered from that fire, debuted on the North Atlantic in the spring of 1930 and quickly took the speed record away from her slightly older sister. The holy grail for passenger lines was to be able to offer a reliable weekly sailing from a major port on either side of the Atlantic. With turnaround times taken into consideration, Bremen and Europa were almost fast enough to be able to do this, but not quite. North German Lloyds still needed a third ship, the Columbus, to be able to offer weekly service. Cunard would eventually claim that holy grail when they proved they could do it with two ships, but that wasn't until after World War II. Still, there were a couple of good years in there. A lot of the film footage you've been seeing throughout this video is from a home movie taken by an American family who sailed to Europe in the early 1930s on one of these ships. It looks like a pretty damn good time, even by 1930s standards. Of course, if you had money, even the Depression was no big deal. On January 30th, 1933, after an exhausting round of political intrigues and several contentious elections, Adolf Hitler achieved the goal he'd been chasing for years. He became Chancellor of Germany, mainly in a political deal made with rivals of other parties who thought erroneously that they could control Hitler. On the day the Nazis took power in Germany, Bremen had just arrived back in her home port. Europa was in New York and would sail back the next night, January 31. No one really understood that the Weimar Republic was really dead as of that day, and Germany had gone into the very dark night that would take her into World War II. Now having achieved power in Germany, Hitler had control of two major assets of the German state, Bremen and Europa. They continued to sail and they faced passengers as if nothing had changed, but of course a lot had changed. Under Hitler's government, North German Lloyd was eventually forced to merge with its major competitor, the Hamburg America line. As he did in all aspects of German society, Hitler essentially Nazified the German merchant marine, flushing out anti-Nazis and putting pro-Nazi officers in charge. But there's definitely something jarring about seeing Bremen as a Nazi ship. She was conceived as the embodiment of Weimar Germany, sleek and modern, yes, but also arty, cosmopolitan, inviting, fun, and welcoming. The passenger experience on the Bremen changed subtly during the Nazi era, but it did change, as did all of Germany. Hitler detested the Weimar Republic and the culture of Weimar. The Art Deco fittings and fine passenger service remained aboard the ship, but reading accounts of Bremen's later career, it's clear that the spirit had gone out of the ship and the crews that sailed on her. I'm not going to spend much time on Bremen's career after 1933. There was a famous incident in 1935 in New York where a group of anti-Nazi demonstrators pulled down the swastika flag from Bremen's stern. Hitler was so enraged by this specific incident that he abolished the old German tricolor. Germany technically had two flags up to that point, and he made the swastika the official flag of the nation of Germany. When war broke out in 1939, Bremen, caught in New York, made a daring escape across the Atlantic to Murmansk. Fellow ship history YouTuber Big Old Boats has a great video on that topic. I suggest you watch it if you haven't seen it. Bremen was commandeered by the Nazi government for military duties. On March 16, 1941, she was set on fire, apparently by a disgruntled crew member, while at quayside in Bremen, and almost totally destroyed. A very sad end to one of the greatest liners of all time. I prefer to think of this beautiful ship as she was in those brief halcyon days, the late summer of 1929, right after her maiden voyage, right before the Depression, before the Nazis, when she was brand new and sparkling with beauty and vitality. In many ways, that was the height of the golden age of the great ocean liners, a day that would never come again. I've got more videos on nautical history. I'm working on one about the SS Ancona, basically the Mediterranean version of the Lusitania disaster, and also one about the USS California, a lesser remembered casualty of the Pearl Harbor attack. So check those out if you like. In the meantime, please visit my website, seanmunger.com, where I've got lots of cool history stuff. And thanks very much for watching.